I'm here to welcome you today, Micah O'Grady, your ULI District Chair, to welcome you to the Greater Austin Regional Luncheon that we're collaborating with the Austin Energy Green Building. I was checking on their website today and I learned that in 1991, Austin Energy Green Building developed the first rating system in the United States for sustainability of buildings. And right here in Austin, we've got Miller Development, which is home to the largest community of sustainable buildings. Very excited to be collaborating with them on the luncheon today, the topic of which is engaging community for equitable development. Okay, so before we turn it over to today's underwriter, we would like to thank the folks from Austin Energy Green Building, Molly Emmerich, Con Frazier, and Christine Walker for their collaboration with ULI Austin to coordinate and produce this event. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Micah. My name is Heidi Kasper, and I manage the residential team for Austin Energy Green Building. Austin Energy Green Building is really pleased to partner with ULI to bring this event to you today, and I want to thank you for joining us. We hope the seminar will provide you with examples, experiences, and practical methods for inclusive engagement. For those of you who may not be familiar with Austin Energy Green Building, we work with the building industry, property developers, homeowners, and government to design and construct buildings that are better for the environment, better for our community, and improve the lives and health of the people who live, work, and play in them. We also provide opportunities for people to learn more about green building through a range of seminars and workshops just like this one. Our monthly webinars are free, and we offer continuing education credits for various professional designations such as AIA, GBCI, and AICP. You can find those offerings on our website. You can look for that link in the chat. Our next offering that we'd like to highlight is coming up in 2 weeks on March 23rd from 11:30 to 1:30 p.m. And that's going to cover sustainability at the airport and all of the unique work that's going on and the rapid growth at Austin Bergstrom. We would really love to have you join us for that. So I would encourage you to check out our website and all the offerings we have going on. But let's get to today's event. Today, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our MC for the event, Dr. Kazique Prince, the Interim Executive Director of the Central Texas Collective for Racial Equity. I'll let him tell you more. So please welcome Dr. Prince.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be with you guys here today. Just want to kind of talk a little bit about our program. So intentional community engagement during project development assists in ensuring and maintaining equity, creating sustainable places for all. Incorporating a wider share of community voice and building allies via community engagement can help achieve more equitable outcomes. Through real-life success stories, this seminar will provide ways to effectively engage diverse community members, bringing about positive momentum and impactful solutions while advancing equity measures during the development process. Today's program will kick off with a fireside chat with Monica Guzmán with Go Austin, Vamos Austin, followed by Sean Garretson providing an overview of the Chestnut Neighborhood Revitalization Corporation, and a panel including Sean with Dr. Laura Cortez, founder of Cortez Consulting, Shoshana Krieger with Building and Strengthening Tenant Action, BASTA, and moderated by Jay Hailey, my friend from Equidad ATX. We will then close with Mandy Lee and one of our great leaders here locally, Nelson Linder of the NAACP, providing information on their emerging community engagement guidelines. And before we begin with the first fireside chat with Monica Guzmán, who I've known for quite some time, I've been asked to provide some information about the new organization I'm helping spearhead, the Central Texas Collective for Racial Equity. And one of the things I would like you to be aware of, that this is work that's been going on for actually several years. There was initially back in 2016, the Mayor's Task Force on Institutional Racism and Systemic Inequities, which was led by Dr. Colette Pierce Burnett, who's a Houston Tilton president, and the former superintendent of Austin ISD, Paul Cruz. Lots of work came out of that process, and one of the main recommendations out of the 278 recommendations that came out of that process was to form a nonprofit. Right now we have a nonprofit association, more than 20 nonprofits and businesses here locally focusing on racial equity. And our main focus is to really coordinate and bring the voices together to focus on racial equity in this region. We are a 5-county initiative and working on a lot of different projects together. And so I encourage you to go to the webpage and learn more about us. And with that said, what I like to do is transition to welcome Monica Guzmán, who I've known for a good amount of time. I don't know about you, Monica, but I feel like I've known you for a super long time. We are at different meetings all the time and see each other at different activities across the city. But I wanted you to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about Go Austin, Vamos Austin.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Monica Guzmán. I am a native Austinite, a product of Austin ISD Public Education and a St. Edward's graduate. My passions include public education and housing affordability, and I serve as a board member with Caritas of Austin. In my free time, I enjoy being a family historian. I'm policy director at GAVA, Go Austin, Vamos Austin. As policy director, I curate the GAVA policy agenda. I lead the policy team and work with the organizing team building a resident coalition in the GAVA zip codes, 78744 and 45 in South and Southeast Austin, as well as 78752, 53, and 58 in the St. John's neighborhood and the Runberg community. GAVA is a coalition of neighbors and community partners working together to break down barriers to healthy living and strengthening neighborhood stability in Austin's Eastern Crescent. Resident-led teams work with GAVA organizers to identify and lead efforts to improve nutrition, increase access to safe physical activity, support climate resilience and neighborhood stability, and advocate for equitable policies and practices in their communities. We envision a future in which zip codes no longer serve as predictors of health outcomes, in which all Austinites in the Eastern Crescent, regardless of race, income, ethnicity, primary language, or immigration status, have access to nutritious food, active living, and neighborhood stability.
Cool. And so, Monica, you've been part of the community for some time. You've been involved here. And I guess just for a little context, how long have you been in Austin? And when you think about some of the work, could you just give us like a kind of a bird's eye view of some of the things you've been involved with as far as the community and the work that you've been doing?
Well, I was born and raised in Austin, except for maybe 13 months, a long time ago. I've always lived in Austin. And when I didn't, I was just down the road in San Antonio. The work I've done in the community varies, kind of learning on my own, being a single parent, about self-advocating. I've been involved in different community efforts in East Austin and North Austin, the Runberg area, the Restore Runberg program funded by the U.S. Department of Justice grant. I was the chair of the advisory team for the last 3 years. I've been on the Caritas board. I'm in my 5th year. And just, there's probably countless other things that's just off the top of my head. I could go on all day long.
Well, and the one of the things I'm most curious about, Monica, is just what have been some of the biggest challenges. Well, let's start with actually the positive. What have been some of the big successes you've experienced when you look at community engagement? And then let's follow up with what have been some of the challenges.
Successes, specifically for GAVA, are when we are able to connect with the residents. Pre-pandemic, it was certainly easier. We started out in South and Southeast Austin. We moved to the north in the fall of 2018. And at that time, I was a North Austin community developer on the GAVA staff. So I already had my connections because of my community work through Restore Runberg. So I went to the different communities, the people I knew, to get to know them better. And that's part of what's really important for successes is not only to know about the community, but to know the community members. And it's done one person at a time, having a one-on-one conversation with them, get to know them. And most of that conversation should be you listening to them, not the other way around. For GAVA, it's a matter of, the popular question is, what keeps you up at night? I mean, we may not literally ask that question, but that's what we want to know is what is it of concern to them about their community. It could be the street they live on, the multifamily property they live on, could be their entire neighborhood. It's a matter of what does community mean to them, and what makes it livable, what makes it healthy, what is good about it for them, what is not good, and what's in between, and getting their perspective. What would they like to see happen to make it better? And so we've had some really good successes when we're able to get residents, now that we've expanded. Just before the pandemic in the fall of 2019, we had a community meeting of the GAVA residents in South Austin, and we were able to coordinate to get some of our North Austin residents to South Austin, working with Austin ISD, their transportation, to help us get residents down there. Mm-hmm. And it's also the, I think one of the really big ones is the Eastern Crescent response to the court ruling on the Land Development Code rewrite. Now, GAVA as an organization, GAVA as a community, we are not against progress. We're not against development, but we want transparency. We want to be included. It is important to center the residents. They know what's good and bad about their community. They have their own ideas of what they want to see in their community. So when you're planning the community, it's important to make sure the community is central to the planning.
Right. And why do you, one of the big challenges, and we've kind of had this conversation before, Monica, what do you think happens that where the community isn't being centered? Because, I work in city government, and I work with a lot of city, and they speak about trying to engage the community, but I think what people walk away with is feeling like, despite their best efforts, assumingly, the center of the community doesn't seem to be centered. And so I'm wondering what happens that the community isn't being centered, or what are the things that you've learned over the years that has led to that disparity of sorts? Am I making sense?
Yes, you are. And a lot of that is, whether it's the city or maybe a private entity, they're more than likely thinking in what do I do? How do I communicate? They don't always know their audience, know the community. So years ago, I remember addressing the school board is you cannot assume that residents can log in to some internet website to watch you, or that they have means to get to your office downtown. You need to come off the dais and meet them where they're at. That's what's really important, is meeting the community where they are at. If that means making sure you put information in a community newspaper, and I don't mean the Statesman, like La Voz, the South Asian, those are the true community papers. More than likely, that's where they're getting their news from. The radio stations, the Latino radio stations, where do they go? Where do they tend to hang out? If you're putting up flyers, and it changes from one community to the next, but for where I live, it's put flyers in the laundromats. Go to the community grocery stores like La Hacienda and La Michoacana. Where are the people going to be? That's where you want to make sure your information is at, in a language that is accessible to them. So it's not going to do any good to hang an English flyer in a Spanish-speaking community, or have a Spanish PSA for an audience that speaks Pashto or Urdu. So it's really important to know them. And as I said, get to know them. Examples of it not quite working is the recent Project Connect. I was, in my role as policy director, as well as my relationship with people at Capital Metro. I've known a lot of them for years. And I've shared this information, and it's like, are you going to have actual community engagement? Or is it just a virtual open house, which to me means you surf the web, that there's no interaction? Oh, no. We're going to have a meeting. There'll be interaction. They were scoping meetings. I didn't even know what that meant. I know very well-educated people who do stuff beyond what I do, and they didn't even know what it meant. And so it's a matter of, you're assuming people have access to the internet. You're assuming they speak English. And even with interpretation that was in place, that's still back to the assumption of that they have access to the internet and they are digitally literate. So there's a lot of assumptions being made, and the assumptions need to stop.
So what would you say, how do you know when you've done enough? Because I know you've seen this, Monica, where, you know, the city or the developer has gone out and they've done their whatever process, right? And they've gotten someone, because it's like they have 100 people listed, and then they go through the process, try to make a decision, and then there's another group who's like, y'all never called me. And so how do you solve for this challenge of trying to touch as many people and get the information you need, but also make the commitment and the change that you're looking to make in meaningful ways? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And when this goes to, I'm going to unfortunately start out with the negative. A lot of groups are like, oh, well, we'll just reach out to the neighborhood associations. They know everybody. No, that's not true. And there are some neighborhoods geographically, they have more than one neighborhood association. One is the one I live in, NACA, the North Austin Civic Association. It is the geographically the largest neighborhood association and chronologically the longest running, but they are not the only one. There are 3 others, to my knowledge, in this neighborhood. The Housing Authority of the City of Austin, or HACA, it's not part of the city government, but they work with the city. All their properties have what's called a resident council. That's a neighborhood association. So you just, you need to see if there's any HACA properties in that neighborhood. Reach out to the residents there. There are also in my neighborhood is the North Austin mobile home community. And thanks to the work of Basta, who I know that somebody will come up later in this event about that. I'm a former Basta organizer, just working with different communities and helping develop tenant associations. And apologies, I'm not trying to steal their thunder, but that is part of my personal experience. And, so it's a matter of not these organizations and entities, they're not all listed in the city registry. So what's important to make sure you've really gotten out there is you may start with that community listing, but find out who are the community leaders and not necessarily a title tied to a neighborhood association. Who is the one person that knows everything that goes on within 3 blocks around where they live? Who's the person that maybe they don't know everything, but they know who does? You want to make sure you make those connections, get to know those people. That they're going to make the difference.
Right. And what's the timeline here? Because people come in, they got some money and they got an idea, and there's like this burning sensation, like because we want to make change and improve communities and save lives. But what you're talking about sounds like it's some commitment of time and resources and relationships. So tell me, like, a little bit what's the timeline for something like this?
Yes, that is true. It takes time to get to know people and build those relationships, and that does not always work on the same timeline as the city or developers. So one thing I would say to anybody who's looking to develop, whether it's housing, multifamily housing, a shopping strip, whatever, is before you even put pen to paper, do your homework, know the community or communities you're looking at, and start doing that. Now, I don't know how much lead time they have before they have to start writing stuff out. But if it's a developer who either has already done development all over the different parts of the city, it's just start doing your homework early enough, because it does take time. And you may still be building those relationships once you've got work going. And so it's not always on track. I can't give you an exact time frame, but it's a matter of just doing the right planning, finding people, maybe an initial, hey, we're thinking about doing, some developing in your neighborhood. Can you help me? I don't know nobody there, but maybe you do. Can you help me get connected with people who are there? I'm sorry, I silenced my phone. Matter of fact, the St. John's neighborhood, a couple of months back, somebody who represents a developer reached out to me about exactly that. We're looking about doing a development in this neighborhood. Can you help me? I know you're working with that neighborhood. So I took the time to have a conversation with that person first about basically what I'm talking about right now. Is I know you want to build, and I know it always goes smoother when you have buy-in from the community, but you can't just go in there and start checking off boxes. It can't be a dog and pony. You need to really have true engagement get to know who those people are. You know, if I know someone, I'll be happy to connect. If I don't, then I'll do my best to direct you. But like I said, it just takes time. And I know everybody, personally, I think too many people are in a rush to get things done.
And there's a rub, right? Is taking too much time, and then there's doing things too quickly. I know Colony Park community has been asking for a swimming pool for feels like 100 years, and that's definitely taking too long. But then you want to move some things quicker. I guess the other thing I was wondering, Monica, you know, this community engagement process can be kind of exhausting. As a city like Austin that's constantly growing, it feels like there's a development project on the horizon every other minute. And so how do we deal with that fatigue that communities sometimes experience, which connects to maybe some of their frustration because things are changing so quickly. They don't know where they fit into all that change. And so how do you deal with that fatigue that may be happening for some of our communities as this development comes in their direction?
That, well, that's part of getting to know them, because you may have one group of residents, what's important to them is about the park. I like taking my kids to the park, but it doesn't have enough lighting or there's not enough programming. So I take my kids, you know, halfway across down to the park where I know there's good lighting, there's good programming. Well, you may have another one, they're more concerned about traffic congestion. Well, obviously, the people who are interested in the parks and really have never mentioned the traffic issue, don't take them in that direction. Have them focus that way. One, that limits, you know, overloading them. And as far as on this side of the table, really engaging, it's important to do self-care. You know, you don't want to overload yourself either. And so that's why, you know, GAVA is not a direct service organization. We have a specific focus. We started out with what we called sectors, and then we realized that it was kind of siloed and they all crisscross. So now we have a case statement. I don't have it memorized, but it's about increasing access to healthy food, increasing opportunities and access to physical activity, building community power, and fostering permanency. You know, people who have not been gentrified, they may be struggling. There needs to be programs in place and development to ensure that they can stay. They have a right to stay where they're at. You know, the people who want to age in place or grow in place, they want to raise their children in the same neighborhood, not moving them around. And the same thing for people who unfortunately have been forced out due to gentrification, find a way to bring them back, right to return. There is a plan out there, the People's Plan, that has been presented to council before. And it's really great. And it's about centering the community. The neighborhood gets to determine, this is what we want. This is what we think is what we need to be able to stay put, or for these people to come back. Now, granted, there's some that they may have already reestablished their roots, but that door still needs to be open. It needs to exist.
Well, Monica, I want to say I've always felt like there's something I can learn from you because you do have those relationships. You have a certain charisma and understanding of what's going on in the community. Particularly, one of the things I've walked away with in our conversation is how important it is to, one, to have that relationship. But number two, when you're dealing with things like fatigue, what I hear you talking about is how important it is to make sure we're attending to their needs, because we have spent so much time trying to create change. You wear people out, and so it builds a certain kind of discontent or frustration with the system, whether it be the city, developers, so on and so forth. And so we attend to people's needs in the relationships that we build. You actually will generate some enthusiasm and energy for this work versus feeling like you're really tamping them down and taking away from the experience. And so I really like your energy. I like your enthusiasm. I want to figure out how I can continue to support what you're doing. And also I want to say thank you for being here today for our fireside chat. We don't have a fire, but we are chatting. So, you know, that's how it works. But I do want to transition to Sean Garretson. Sean Garretson is a friend of mine, I feel like, because he's been in my community for quite a long time. And so, Sean Garretson, I'm going to allow you opportunity to introduce yourself. And if you don't mind, transition into your presentation for today.
Sure. Good morning, Kazique. It was really great to hear that conversation with you and Monica. And you all had asked me to talk a little bit about our nonprofit organization. I wear a couple of different hats. You know, I own my own urban planning business, but I'm also the board president for Chestnut Neighborhood Revitalization Corporation. And when I moved into East Austin about 20 years ago, just as an urban planner, I wanted to get involved. And I remember being with Scotty Ivory. Some of you might remember Scotty Ivory or know Scotty Ivory. And we were at a groundbreaking for a new neighborhood park that we were trying to get built. And I asked her, you know, is this exciting? And she said, you know, I am so ticked off. She's like, it's great to have this park, but it took you white people moving in here to get this thing done. And that for me was such an eye-opening experience and really set the tone for how I wanted to approach my leadership role with the Chestnut Neighborhood Revitalization Corporation. We were created in 1999 by Reverend Joseph Parker of the David Chapel Church. He actually shepherded the first neighborhood plan to be adopted in the city of Austin. And one of the things that was kind of an implementation piece was to create our organization. So we're managed by a board of directors. I'm the board chair, but also serve as a developer representative. And we've built a bunch of single family affordable houses. We've built a 22 unit senior housing project over at MLK and EM Franklin. And then we've built a 33 unit mixed use affordable and mixed income affordable project at the Chicon, also with 5,000 square feet of commercial. But, you know, as I started thinking about this presentation, I changed a lot around because one of the themes for me is who are we planning for? Who are we enhancing the community for? And I started to kind of, you know, I'm an analytical kind of dork, and I started to throw in some charts about demographic change, et cetera. But we've all seen that. We all know that we have had, you know, black flight from East Austin for the last 20 years, and nothing really has done a very effective job with that. So our organization is charged with affordable housing, and you know, we decided we were going to get aggressive and really try and focus our efforts around 12th and Chicon, which at one point in time was the heart and soul of the African American community. And so we did a lot of outreach. That corner of 12th and Chicon is where 4 neighborhoods all come together. And so, you know, we worked with them pretty extensively. These are some of the pictures for the properties that we ended up buying with City of Austin funds. But and by the way, this was one of the signs that was in one of the bars that we bought, that at that time was really just used for, it was a pool hall and a lot of drug deals were going down. But you know, you no longer have to be 37 years old to enter this club. So it's much younger, much whiter, much richer, much more educated. And so it's a challenge and a struggle for us of, you know, who are we trying to create affordable housing for? You know, I mean, the city has such an ambitious goal that we have to kind of stay up with it. So we bought these 3 properties in East Austin, and we worked with some designers. This is kind of what it looked like when we bought it, and over several years. And these are the 3 properties that we ended up building on, this one and this one right here. And we created 2 buildings that look very similar to this. And what was interesting about it is when we first, as a board, approached the neighborhoods, we wanted to build rental housing. We felt more comfortable with the financials of rental housing. But to a person, the neighborhoods said, we will only support you doing owner-occupied housing. And so we really had to kind of think hard about that and financially if that was going to work for us. And we ended up doing it. And so, you know, we also required that any broker that wanted to bring a commercial buyer to us, that buyer had to come in front of our neighborhood association and tell us why they made sense to go into this building. So it's a really solid community that we've created. The commercial owners are all local business owners, most of whom it's their first storefront, if you will. So it's a super tight community. And, you know, we really did a lot of outreach, not only, you know, going to the neighborhoods, but we had several kind of open events. We went to churches. Big believer that, you know, barbecue gets a lot of people out. You can see that kind of cooking in the distance. And, you know, as we approach this 3rd building, because we only built 2 buildings, as we have approached the 3rd building, our board has been, again, real cognizant of who are we planning for? And you know, the income levels, even for median household income, have increased so much. So we are actually designing this project under the Affordable Housing Unlocked Ordinance, which, for some of you who don't know that, it waives most compatibility standards and a lot of site development standards, and including parking. So we're going to have, and we could go 7 stories here, but as a board, we decided that, you know, 5 stories was probably about as much as we wanted to push the envelope in that neighborhood, especially with single family abutting the rear of the building. We are actually going to be building 53 units, 37 affordable, 3 commercial spaces. And the reason I'm here is actually in talking to Austin Energy Green Building, they were very excited about the level of sustainability that we're putting into this project. We're going to have 2 electric vehicles on site that is only for the use of the owners. We're also talking to them about creating a mobility hub. And so we're in the planning stages right now. And, you know, we're about to, over the next couple of months, embark in a pretty robust public participation phase, because the mobility hub aspects, and especially the right-of-way area, it's a public space. And there's a lot that we can do there. And that's kind of the overview, Kazique, I wanted to give. I know we're kind of short on time, and I'm going to be part of this panel coming up here as well.
Yes, Sean, I have to say, I'm always really excited about your project. I pass it pretty frequently. It's just down the street. And for me personally, it has a meaning for me because my grandfather and grandmother actually lived in Austin back during this time. Actually went to some of these places that you are close in proximity to. And they were just, it was a hub. That's where you went to hang out and have a good time with family and create community. And I imagine looking down from where their position is today, they'd probably be very happy to see some of the work that you've been doing. And so I really appreciate everything you've been doing. So thank you for your presentation. And I know you're going to be in the next section. So we're going to kind of start there. I want to transition, if we can, to my friend, Jay Hailey, who I've actually had the privilege and honor of being able to work with for some time. Actually, we started off, it felt like in a garage somewhere, Jay, with this burgeoning idea of working with the community over in the Colony Park area. But Jay, I just wanted to say thank you for being here today, and I want to give you opportunity to introduce yourself and begin our process for our panel discussion.
Great. Thank you, Kazique. It's been a great pleasure to work with you as well, and Ashton and Alba, and a great team of other community leaders with our nonprofit there in East Austin and Colony Park in particular. It's my privilege to be the moderator of the next segment of this program. And Monica, your presentation was great. It was a great introduction to what we're talking about today, and we really appreciate your work that you've been doing. It's been pioneering, and we've learned a lot from you and from others who've been doing this work for many, many years. So we'll pick up from where you left off in this roundtable discussion that will invite Sean to join us now in this discussion. And in addition to Sean, we'll have Laura Cortez, and she'll introduce herself here in just a moment, and also Shoshana Krieger, with BOSTA. You already heard references to BOSTA previously in the work that they've been doing with tenants here in Austin. But before I ask Laura and Shoshana to introduce themselves, let me tell you a little bit about myself. Great privilege to be here and be the one moderating this. I've practiced real estate law here in Austin for more than 50 years. So I've lived here a long, long time. I retired from the full-time practice of law about 3 years ago as a partner at DLA Piper. And in my retirement during the last 3 years, as Kazique mentioned, we got together with Kazique and Ashton and Alba and some other leaders in the community and formed an organization called Equidad ATX. And many of you will recognize our name is the Spanish word for equity. And that was very intentional because really that's foundational to what the organization is all about. Also want to say that Equidad is adopted a model for neighborhood revitalization that was pioneered by an organization called Purpose Built Communities out of Atlanta. And there are three foundational pillars on which that model is based. First, it advocates for mixed income housing is the first pillar. The second pillar is a cradle to career education pipeline is the second component. And then the third component is health and community wellness. So we try to take a holistic approach to community development, neighborhood revitalization that combines all three of those things as supports for one another. And we'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing over in the Colony Park area and what we hope to do in other neighborhoods in the Eastern Crescent as we go along during the presentation. But now I want to invite Laura Cortez with Cortez Consulting to introduce herself and tell you a little bit about her background and what she's been doing. And then I'll invite Shoshana to introduce herself. And then we'll go back then and ask Laura and Shoshana to talk a little bit about specific projects that they've been working on. So first, Laura, if you'll just introduce yourself and what you do and a little of your background.
Thank you, Jay, and it's wonderful to be here with everyone. Lots of great friends on this panel. And more importantly, I want to thank UIL Austin and all of the sponsors, because community engagement is such a vital work to what we do. And it's nice to be able to highlight that work here today. So as Jay mentioned, I'm the CEO of Cortez Consulting. I want to share a little bit of background of what happened and how this all came about. But for 14 years, I spent the majority of my time in higher education. And as I was moving along on my track, I came along to a position with the University of Texas at Austin as a director of public engagement. And at the time, they were involved in a project called the Colony Park Sustainable Community. And we'll be discussing that and talking about that in this project as it relates to this conversation. And what our organization learned throughout that process in the time that we did it, and many of you probably have heard of that organization, is we found three key things were really important about how we approach public engagement in the community. And one of the things that Monica highlighted early on in her talk was that sometimes people aren't aware or they're not informed. And so one of the biggest things we notice when we work with the community is having that information and informing them about your projects, whatever that is that's taking place. Another one of our approaches also is to make sure we are educating the process. I think coming to this work in public engagement as an educator, what I found is that the majority of the time where you find tensions and struggles and frustrations is not because people don't want to learn about it. It's actually because they want to learn more. And how are we bringing them to the table, making sure we make this an educational process for everyone. And then the last thing we strive to do is make sure that everyone is empowered in the process. And I can vividly remember walking away, working with some folks. We work quite closely with the Turner Roberts Recreation Center and all of their staff. And I remember doing many public meetings there. And I remember one day they were organizing their own meeting and walking in and seeing them just take on the philosophy that we had about welcoming the community, making sure there was ways that they could be engaged, and just seeing a process of where the community can take over what they've built and what they're going to be involved in. So that's a little bit about Cortez Consulting, what we do as an organization. We're always making sure, and we particularly came about because we wanted to make sure that those individuals who were traditionally not at the table were taking part in these conversations about development. We work in the green spaces and transportation as well, and we see that pretty much all over the projects that we work on. And so on the next slide, I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about the Colony Park Sustainable Community. I love this picture, and I'm sharing this picture with you. It was pre-COVID. This is when we had our grand opening of the Colony Park District Park. And if any of you have been out to this beautiful area, you can actually see downtown in the background there. The beautiful mural. This park was actually an initiative of so many nonprofits in Austin, so many park nonprofits. But more importantly, this project is now in its next phase. And as you can see there, the individuals who are key or the organizations that are key to this project is the City of Austin Economic Development, and actually the Colony Park Neighborhood Association, and Catellus Development Corp., who's actually been selected as the master developer, and we'll be working on this for a number of years. And then as we move on to the next slide here, we want to share with you the actual master plan itself. This effort took place in 2014. One thing that was really key to this particular project is that there was 2 phases. The first phase was the planning stage. And actually in that planning stage, we worked for quite some years to make sure that the community was engaged in the project. What's very different about where this is at, we want to give you guys a sense of where this actual project is located. It's on the east side of 183. Our colleagues have already mentioned a little bit about the work going on in this, but we consider this also on the Eastern Crescent. It's one of the neighborhoods and areas where, when I first came to this project, just realizing the lack of services and programs. And many times when you host meetings or you have different public events, there's somewhere to have them at various different locations, cool conference rooms. Here in the Colony Park area, we had one recreational center that had been recently built and was the hub of where all the community came together to do their activities. The other place where a lot of activities took place was in the schools. So we spent a number of our time at parent meetings, working with principals, and making sure that we connected in the spaces and places where parents and children that were living in these communities. So this area that you see there, that red part, is the Colony Park Sustainable Community. And then the yellow, everything that you see on there, is the 5 census tracts in the area that we engage in this particular project. This is the master plan that was adopted in 2014. It was a planning process that was actually funded by a US HUD grant. It was a $3 million challenge grant. And it had numerous partners, as I mentioned, the University of Texas, ACC, the Neighborhood Association, as well as many of you are familiar with Farr and Associates, Doug Farr, as well as Laura Toots and her organization at the time, Urban Design Group, which is now Dunaway. And they work effortlessly to try to make sure that they represented this 208 acres of space. And as you can see on there, the gray area is all the existing neighborhoods. And so the challenge actually with this particular planning process, that the neighborhood came together and said, we want to make sure that this just isn't one other space in our community, but it's something that unifies us and benefits the existing communities. So this actually was the 2014 master plan that was approved by Austin City Council. It was what we walked around and talked about, shared with the communities, made sure it was an area that was walkable, sustainable, had a lot of great different options for commercial and housing. And then as you see there on the bottom where Loyola Lane is, as I mentioned earlier, when we actually came to do this work in early 2012, we noticed that there was no coffee shop, there was no grocery store, there were not health resource centers or any facilities for families to go and get a checkup. And so one of the things that was integrated into this master plan was to ensure that it incorporated resources that the community so desperately needed. Just to show you what's happened since then, this is a slide that we put together last year in 2020. As you can see there where Colony Park is in orange, you can see all the development that has now since then happened since I came to this project. And what that has meant for us is that it's more partners to work with, but also more communities to serve. So ensuring that we don't only work in this 5 census tracts, but that we're working with all these new families who are coming to the table, who are in need of resources, who are thinking about where their children are going to go to play, where are the spaces I can go to have coffee with my friends or neighbors. And so this is now what has been the growth in the area, and something that we're keeping in mind, as well as transportation. What's been great is to work with our partners in transportation. The future Green Line, as hopefully that comes online, will actually touch this particular development, but then we'll also head into the Manor area. And then the last thing I want to share with you, because I know I will be on the panel, is there's proposed improvements. So this process, one of the benefits that I've had as a public engagement firm to be part of this is that it's been a 10-year process. And so what that has meant for me as an organization is I've got to see it move along in the process, see multiple players come to the table, but more importantly, something that was approved in 2014, always, you have to relook at that. And so this is actually a map that has been developed by our master developer team, Catalyst Development, their team, McCann Adams, everyone who's working on this particular plan and its future, but what it will look like. A lot of players in the city also are trying to make sure that these neighborhoods are connected. So that orange line you see there is to make sure that we create a road to actually connect the community and the development. And this is being shared. We've had several meetings now to make sure the community is informed that we've kept the spirit and intention of what that 2014 master plan looked like and making improvements. And then the last slide, the most important thing is that the community has been at the center of this entire project. And throughout this time that it's been developed, one of the things they've identified is 8 community pillars or 8 community goals. And these particular goals focus around food access, education, workforce, housing, and open spaces. And as you can see, there's 8 different ones there. And so what has happened with this project, when we work on different topics or we work on different initiatives, we make sure they're focused on these 8 pillars, which community leaders have identified are lacking in their community. So in adding to the conversation we had earlier in the fireside chat, I think it's also important to align what your project goals are as a developer or as a city entity to make sure they also align with the community goals, because together that's how you create a synergy that people can work around and identify some real solutions. So I'm going to stop there. That is my introduction and just a little brief history about the Colony Park Sustainable Community. And I will be on the panel to answer questions later.
Great, Laura. Let me kind of follow up just real quickly with a couple of comments about what you've just seen. As Laura said, what that short slide presentation represents 10 years of work on Laura's part and her work with the community and her team members. And just to go back to the very beginning, Laura and I have talked a bit about the history of all of this, and she brought me up to speed on kind of how this all began. And in 2012, the city had applied for and received a $3 million grant from HUD to do planning in this area, which was great news. That was a significant amount of money to be able to give attention to a community that had not had much attention. But the problem was that the people who lived in the community had really not been involved in that process, didn't even know anything about it, and had no real input in applying for and receiving that grant. So when community leaders in the area found out about it, they began to organize and advocate for having a seat at the table. And that was not a normal process at that time, back more than 10 years ago now. But Laura then worked with UT, and UT was engaged to be the community engagement consultant for that. And that's when her work began. And that led up then to one of the most comprehensive community engagement processes that had ever taken place within the city, and culminated then first in the development of the master plan in 2014, as she just described, and then a second process then to select a master developer, which was ultimately Catalyst. And now there's a negotiation of a master development agreement. So Laura has now continued on in the work she was doing up to that point in implementing now that, which will go on for who knows how many more years. So I bring that up just, first of all, Laura may be too shy to explain her role in all of that process, but also to confirm what Monica said earlier, that this is a long-term process. To be able to have an impact in a community, you got to be prepared to stay for the duration. And it takes that type of patience and that type of focused energy and effort to be able to really make an impact in any neighborhood. So I just wanted to to make that comment on behalf of Lauren. We'll talk some more about that when we get to everyone talking together. But now let me turn it over to Shoshana to introduce herself and to tell you a little bit about what the types of give you a couple of examples of the types of projects that she's involved in. I'm so glad to have Shoshana because she'll give a little different perspective on community engagement than we have with what most of us are familiar with in the kind of the development-based community engagement, where you have a developer wanting to do a deal and they go and engage with the community. And Shoshana is working with a particular community, a particular constituency of the community in her work with tenants. And so the approach that she takes uses a lot of the same principles we'll be talking about, but she approaches it from a little different perspective, and that'll come out in the discussion. But Shoshana, if you'll introduce yourself and then give us a couple of examples of projects that you've worked on with BASTA here in recent years.
Yeah, sure. So first, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. And I think, Jay, what you just said of that the way we approach our work and what we would define as community engagement is probably very different than you have a development project you want to push through and you need to go through the community engagement process in order to move the project forward. So I think it's important to distinguish those two roles, not saying one is better or worse than the other, but just kind of name that those are different approaches. And so my name is Shoshana Krieger. I'm with BASTA, Building and Strengthening Tenant Action, or Buscando Acción y Solidaridad que Transforme el Arrendamiento. And we organize tenants in Austin. And our approach to community engagement is pretty similar to the approach that Monica was talking about with GAVA, and we've partnered on various projects with GAVA. We're a community-based organization, and we are working with residents, specifically tenants, to form community organizations, tenant organizations at properties which we work at, and then to work to advocate for solutions to the problems that tenants are collectively addressing. And core to what we do is building power of those residents and ensuring that residents with whom we work have autonomy over the places which they live. And as everyone probably on this call knows, especially in Texas, tenants don't have that much power. So we're oftentimes in a position where it's tenants can organize, and on the other end is a lot of money from landlords, a lot of money from developers, a lot of kind of political capital that those folks have, and laws and regulations that disproportionately favor landlords in Texas. So it's really been an uphill battle in our 5 years of existence. On our team, we have really experienced tenant organizers, we have paralegals, and we have attorneys who also will support our work when litigation is the appropriate tactic to use. A lot of the campaigns and the work that we're doing don't even touch upon a new development project or a rehab of a property. But at times, the associations we work with are at complexes where there's a rezoning which is going to occur, right? So we will then enter into the more affirmative, equitable development space. Or there's a big rehab of the property and residents want to be able to have a say in how it's going to be rehabbed. Where are they going to go during the rehab? Will there be kitchens where they are? Will it be close to schools? How will their belongings be handled? Because that's a very big issue where we've seen a lot of property damage as a result of movers who aren't doing right by the tenants. So a lot of times, like, our work is a lot of those like little things which have a really big impact on the experience, just the everyday lives of the folks who we work with. So I already talked a little bit about our tenants association work. It's the core component of what BASTA does. We've worked with over 24 tenants associations at complexes, and we work with residents through on the ground pre-COVID canvassing and outreach to engage everyone at a property, and then to work with them to collectively prioritize what issues they want to work on, and then collectively strategize on the best tactics to use to achieve the solutions that they want. And those tactics can range from doing mass written repair requests, where we collect the repairs issues of every tenant, and then we send it in by certified mail, to petitions, to lawsuits, to press conferences, to meetings with elected officials, to meetings with management, where we're prepping leaders on how to negotiate, and doing lots of role play. And a key component of all of this work is leadership development, that the tenants who we are working with are at the forefront of the conversations, of the negotiations. And that means that everything may take a lot longer than if I just picked up the phone and called a council member and like, this is terrible. But getting tenants to be the ones to decide collectively what they want, what their platform is, and then do the outreach to the council office and then be at that table, right? That's a longer process. And that's, I know there were some comments in the Q&A about this tension between real community engagement taking a long time. I think Dr. Prince also mentioned this, and then the reality of you want to move things forward quickly with a project, and we're in a deep affordable housing crisis, right? And meaningful engagement and leadership development and power building takes time. That, though, is the way BASTA approaches our work, which isn't necessarily the community engagement process, which y'all are engaging in as developers. And I don't actually think it would be appropriate for y'all to be engaging in that deep level of work and relationship building, that you don't have time to do that. So I think the partnering with organizations who are doing that and doing your due diligence of who are those organizations becomes really important. And how do you partner that? Because as developers, y'all aren't going to be doing a whole bunch of one-on-ones and all of this work. But if you can identify organizations who are doing that work, then you know that the voices of the community members, which those organizations are working with, are going to be heard. So in addition to our tenants association work, and just some of the issues we've worked on, I talked a little bit about tactics, but some of the issues we've worked on are a lot of substandard housing, getting repairs, getting mold properly remediated, towing, bullying managers. Then North Lamar Mobile Home Park, we assisted those residents in purchasing their community as a cooperative back in May in the middle of the pandemic, which was quite a feat. Then we also have worked with tenants on relocation plans, and also of ensuring that they're getting properly compensated if they are going to be relocated as a result of a rezoning or a redevelopment. Then we also have a theater and arts program. We employ a theater of the press techniques, which is a participatory theater method, which allows kind of lived experiences to be dictating what the performance is, and then also engaging audiences in those presentations. And we have some of our work has now converted to the virtual environment because of COVID. So we have a radio play, A Tale of Two Citizens, which explores the interconnectedness between homelessness and substandard housing. And so folks can check that out on our social media. We've also been engaged a lot, especially this past year, in anti-eviction work. We're the anchor of the Eviction Solidarity Network, and helping tenants navigate the ever-changing world of tenant protections. In the past 3 weeks, we've been a mutual aid organization, sending bucket brigades to complexes which don't have water, ensuring that thousands of meals were distributed, engaging about 300 volunteers alongside Workers Defense Project, who's been just an amazing partner in this. But we've really been carting water throughout the city. And now we're pivoting towards organizing at properties where there were longstanding outages and where there were lengthy outages, and where we know they're longstanding maintenance problems at those properties. So the fact that they were without water for so long and there's so much storm damage is no accident. It's because of negligent management. And I will apologize for my cough because I was door knocking 2 days ago at a building which was just covered in mold. And there are senior residents right now who are being poisoned as we speak because their management is not giving them proper places to live. We also do community education presentations just in the field. And then just 2 other things I want to just quickly mention are a language justice, which Monica was talking about, of the importance of ensuring that there is interpretation and translation available in all of the languages that a community speaks. So we have one property where we do simultaneous interpretation in 7 languages, which is can be pretty insane and can be pricey. So that's something you should be putting into your budgets. And having real professional interpretation is important, not just the kid of someone who happens to speak English as well, translating or interpreting for their parent. So we have simultaneous interpretation equipment, and we really are deeply committed to language justice. It also doesn't just stop at a flyer. It means if you put a flyer out in the language, you have to figure out what you're going to do when someone calls you and you don't speak the language, and are you using language line, or what are the resources you're using to really meaningfully engage folks in other languages. And then also that ties to digital inclusion work. And I know that there were some comments in the Q&A on this. We've really shifted to a lot of digital inclusion work since the pandemic began. We have a Chromebook lending library to our tenant leaders. We have spent countless hours getting people signed up for low-income internet programs and doing trainings, and just getting 15 people online for a regular tenant meeting takes at least 2 staff members' times for a half hour to an hour before the meeting just to set people up and get them on. So I think we need to focus on digital inclusion, but I do not think that there is a way to virtually be inclusive and do real community engagement. We are doing the best we can, but it is impossible to really meaningfully do because the digital divide is so great. But resources into digital inclusion and making the world 5 years from now not be the world I'm talking about now, I do have some hope for. The digital inclusion and language justice overlay, really, really hard. We're doing a simultaneous interpretation at most of our meetings. If folks are interested in how to do that, I and my interpretation team can spend hours talking about it. So that's kind of us in a nutshell, just on the kind of projects to highlight, Jay. So the North Lamar Mobile Home Park purchase, it's a 69 lot community right north of Research Boulevard. And they bought their property after a 5-year struggle in May. And they are now a cooperative ownership. They are navigating the struggles of how to maintain the property, all of the winter storm damage, and all of that, but it is going successfully. And with the pandemic, not one family has been evicted from that property, in large part because the community who owns it cares about making sure that all residents can remain, and about how do we leverage resources to make sure that all members are able to pay their rents to the cooperative. And then another project just to highlight, which we've worked on, is at Cross Creek Apartments, which is now Creek's Edge Apartments, which we've worked at for many, many years. But back in 2016, we organized there and prevented over 36 evictions of tenants. And then as part of, there was going to be a sale of the property. And as part of that sale, we got commitments and an agreement which capped rent increases for a number of years, which require the acceptance of Section 8 vouchers, and which there were a few other benefits to tenants. And just this last year, we were able to enforce that agreement, or use that agreement, to make sure that they did not terminate the leases of Section 8 long time Section 8 residents at that property. So it was a way we were able to leverage what at first was a struggle over not having hot water into longer term gains through negotiation. And that negotiation would not have happened without some agitation and conflict, because power doesn't just cede. Power isn't like, oh yes, please have a seat at the table. Like, that's not how power operates. And so if you, and community engagement, if we're talking about engaging marginalized communities are marginalized for a reason, and that's because of systems and that's because of structures. And so just being nice isn't, and asking isn't going to change that power imbalance. So I think oftentimes there needs to have actual meaningful community engagement. You actually need struggle to get to the other side, where then you can be talking about negotiation and consensus. But I think that it is necessarily oppositional at certain moments if you're talking about meaningful long-term community engagement.
Thank you, Shoshana. And let's, Sean, we'd like to draw you into the conversation now again, and kind of begin the discussion among the three of you on the three different perspectives that you have on some of the issues we're talking about. The first topic that I'd like to focus your attention on is really kind of the foundation for this conference, which is equity, and specifically what we mean by equity and what we mean by inequity in the context of the projects that you're working on and the work that you're doing. But Sean, first, given your planning background, most of the people in this participating in this conference have heard of or used or know very well the idea of place-based planning, and that has an equity component to it. And could you give us a short definition of how you would describe place-based planning, and then we'll invite others to talk about how that plays into their work and on their projects. What is place-based planning?
Sure. I think, we've all kind of alluded to it, but it's, when you have a certain geographic area, it's really involving the community itself in finding out solutions. I think Monica did a really good job of kind of like her own SWOT analysis that she brings to that table. But, really incorporating the community to find solutions that are going to be benefiting the community and not just, a developer itself. So everything from design and function and et cetera.
Right. So fundamentally, it's bringing the community in as being a decision maker, in the process, not just having decisions made for them, but being a participant in, what ultimately happens in their community. Is that a fair way to describe it?
That's exactly right.
Laura, tell me how that has played a role in your work in Colony Park. Has place-based planning been incorporated into the process that you've been going through the past 10 years, and what has been the effect of that, and how has it been implemented in the Colony Park area?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because then I even see in the chat someone mentioned about clean water and transportation. So when we first came to this project, when you go into the community, they are not so much preoccupied with what you want to develop and what survey you want them to complete. What the first thing that we were hit with, and many times we would go to meetings and, community members saying, we need this. This is our priority right now. We need you to go fix that street because, we can't get through, or this sidewalk is incomplete, or we don't have bus stops like everywhere else in Austin. We're standing in the sun and this is my only mode of transportation. We've had families come up to us and say basic necessities like, my child needs a mattress. Is there a program in Austin or in the city that you can point us to? So what I realized that we had to do as an organization, and I think many of these people in the panels, that you have to be really an advocate of all resources, because the community is going to come to you and say, when I'm building trust with you and when I come to you with these problems and issues, how are you going to solve them? And so as an organization and myself, I had to really learn to be a connector for the community, to advocate for them on their behalf, particularly if I'm asking them to give me their feedback on something. So we really used a type of engagement that was about service first. And so when we first came to the table and we were doing public meetings in Colony Park, we actually coordinated family resource fairs. And we started saying, you know, if we're going to be hosting these public meetings, we need to bring other people to the table to talk about resources like, you know, helping them with their rent, bringing on sustainable food centers so that we can talk about any programs for food. You know, so we just had to be really savvy. And I mean, we would have family resource fairs with 50 vendors, 50 people, all different organizations across the city that would be able to provide their, and I mean, we had families in our last event, which Equidad was also part of, and many partners, where we had close to 1,000 people in a rec center. Because they knew they were going to come and find out about services and programs. And while they were at our event, they were able to provide their feedback and discussion about what was happening in the bigger picture. So my biggest advice on that, when you are doing place-based engagement, and if you are really intentional about saying, I'm going to be part of this project to make a change, you have to be ready to hear what the community is going to be bringing forth as far as their needs and concerns, because that's foremost in their mind when you go and meet with them and chat with them.
Can you think offhand of examples of things that might not have happened if the city and the developer had not listened to the community, things that would have been overlooked and maybe no one would have thought of as being important or necessary for the development of Colony Park? Can you?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that we talked about is that, you know, constantly having your ear at the table, like making sure you're listening to the community constantly, because, you know, we've entered into this project and now we're in our second phase. You know, partners change, the environment changes, but what has been consistent is what the community has been asking for. And I think that that has to be primary in the work that you're doing, along with the needs and wants of everyone else. So what we really did, and I wanted to share this, is that at the end of the project that was funded by the HUD grant, as you mentioned, after that 3-year-long process, the community actually brought forth not only these community benefits early on, but they brought together a list of criteria of what is a productive project and how you can best engage the community. And that particular document, we share it as we move along in the project. These are things that have worked. These are ways that is important to engage with the community. And so I think, and now the developer, I can say, you know, who we have on board, we're extremely grateful to have Catalyst Development and all their partners. They've lived in Austin, they know how Austin functions, and I think they've been really open to that. And they've come through with saying, we want to honor what all this engagement you've done this 10 years, and now how can we build that with our own networks? And how can we move this project forward? Because it is a big, heavy lift. There's a huge investment that has to go into developing these 208 acres of land. So I hope that answers that, Jay, as to how we've been keeping it going forward.
Yeah, that's great. Sean, how about with respect to the Chicon? How did place-based planning fit into that process, and how is it fitting into your phase 2? And how are you going about getting the input that you are seeking from the community?
Yeah, it's a different process that we're going around, that we're engaging in now than what we did earlier. There's something I've been dying to say, and it's not a direct response to your question, but I think it's appropriate, and I think it might stimulate some conversation. That is, I think, for me, one of the elephants in the room is the City of Austin development and review process. And how the city council will listen to the loudest and the last person at the very end, and then everything gets thrown out with the baby with bathwater. I think having that level of predictability in that process is really important. And, as some of the other participants were saying too, developers need to go beyond just the neighborhood planning contact team and whoever is associated with that. I saw one of the comments of, how can you be sure that the neighborhood planning contact team has your best interest? You have to just show up. You have to go to the meetings and participate and really provide your feedback. So Jay, I'm sorry, I had to throw that out.
I appreciate the comment.
Yeah, I think that's a comment. And, I think we, I don't want to be duplicative because I think that we use very similar methodologies as Laura has described in some of our processes. We probably, in terms of what you guys did too, we also pull out papers and markers and pens and allow the community to engage and give us feedback. And if there's children that just want to draw a sign or say, I like these colors, we incorporate that. It's important. And it all kind of weaves together a good fabric that ultimately is representing the community.
I think one of the striking differences between what you're doing in central East Austin and what Laura is working on in really the far edge of Austin, at the outer edge of development there east of 183, is that in Colony Park, the population has not changed that much. The demographics and the people who live there and the stakeholders has, forgive me if I'm not saying this accurately, Laura, but I don't think it's changed very much over the past 10 years. You're pretty much dealing with the same community now as you were dealing with 10 years ago, for the most part. Would that be a fair comment, Laura? Okay. Whereas in Central East Austin, the neighbor you showed us in some of your slides, the neighborhood you're dealing with is totally different than what you dealt with 10 or 12 years ago.
Totally different. And, I was part of an affordable housing accelerator here in Austin about a year or two ago. And part of that was to really push this envelope of micro units and potentially carless development, because what I haven't talked about is, it's, in affordability, we talk about, lowering the rent or lowering the mortgage, but there are so many other costs. Transportation is the number 2 cost after housing in a community, in a household. Food, utilities, if you can lower all of those, that's really important. But, as I mentioned earlier, our initial community input and gathering, that was almost 12, 13 years ago. It was a very, very different community then. And than it is now. And so we actually had, before we actually decided to do a project under Affordable Housing Unlocked without cars or without parking, we had several focus groups. And interestingly, we focused hard on the creative community, the creative class, artists, musicians, and had dinner parties and just kind of talked with them about that. And, just didn't have an agenda, just had kind of like what we're having here, a fireside chat and dinner, which is, not, didn't scare people. It was very, welcoming, and people were pretty open to share their thoughts.
Shoshana, let me direct your attention to an issue that we've talked about before several times. During the 21-day challenge regarding equitable development that the ULI went through, and several people participating in this conference will have participated in, there was a discussion about the difficulty of engaging with renters, and the fact that they're quite often in this engagement process aren't at the table for a variety of reasons. We're all used to dealing with owner association, neighborhood association groups, and neighborhood leaders, but renters are typically not at the table, in those discussions. And you and I have talked about, how do we engage with renters? And you've educated me a bit on, what that might look like and how difficult that can be and how long it might take to do that. But a significant segment of the community is not at the table in these projects that Sean is working on, the projects that we're working on in Colony Park. What advice do you have to both of these groups and to others who need to and want to reach out to renters to get their perspective on development?
Yeah, I mean, 100% renters are not at the table generally in these conversations. And I was struck, Sean, as you were talking about the community demanding home ownership and who is the community. And we've been saying throughout this panel, the community. I've said the community, but I think that that also is a misnomer. There isn't the community. There are a whole bunch of communities within a community, right? And so paying attention to who has a seat at the table and who's the loudest voice at the end of the day, who is getting their way, who oftentimes do not represent the community or even a substantial part of the place-based community where they're saying they are representative of. And oftentimes they're the folks who have the most access or have historically been the loudest voices. And if they're historically the loudest voices, they probably also aren't the loudest voices for renters, because renter issues have not been at the forefront of conversations in Austin, probably since Austin's inception. And when we're talking about reaching communities who have not been engaging for a long time and underrepresented communities, then you have to also look at who are renters. And 75% of Black Austinites are renters, and 66% of Latinx Austinites are renters. So in terms of talking about equity, focusing on renters becomes incredibly, incredibly important. Generally, neighborhood associations not going to be reflective of renter voices. There are a few exceptions to that, but generally neighborhood, the contact teams, not going to be reflective and representative of renter voices. I think you can talk with BASTA and to see if there are tenants associations in the neighborhoods which you're building, and if there are some large complexes where a project or nearby a project, right? Doing like good old fashioned door knocking, because a lot of renters, and this is a part of, I think a particular challenge to Austin and a lot of Southern cities, is this issue of permanency, which Monica was talking about. That permanency, we do not place a value on permanency of our renters in Austin. So a lot of renters are moving from place to place every year or two. And it's not like that in other cities. In other cities, because of rent stabilization and other tenant protections, renters have lived in the same place for a long time. And their engagement in those places, I think, is generally much greater. So I think that the lack of renter participation isn't as much an indicator of, oh, somehow renters don't care about their communities. It's reflective of the fact that there isn't permanency in the rental situation in Austin and in Texas because of laws and policies which make it that way. And so that also means on the flip side of creating of when we are developing, of making sure that there are renter protections which are stabilizing families and allowing families to be able to remain in the places which they're living for as long as they want to. And that there should be a good reason if you're going to move to evict them. So I think that to answer your question of like how, right? Like I've stated the problem, which it's easy to state problems, and it's a lot harder to state solutions, and then even harder to implement solutions. I think identifying neighborhood organizations or citywide organizations which touch on renters. I think talking to churches, like what are spaces, a lot of the places Monica was talking about, churches, schools, parent support specialists, like know the heartbeat of a community like none other, right? So maybe do something with like using parent support specialist networks so where they can invite parents to come out. But what are some of the spaces which aren't kind of the usual suspects who are going to be part of the conversation no matter what, right? It's not saying that you shouldn't be part of the conversation, but how can you get additional voices to the table where there are networks? And then just good old fashioned, I mean, like if you know that there are a few complexes in the general area, of like just putting flyers to invite people to the meeting on their doors, right? Like that's something that's not like super meaningful engagement, but that's at least reaching those networks.
Laura, let me get your perspective on kind of a new area of inequity that we've discovered because of the circumstances we're living through right now. And I'm speaking specifically of COVID-19. Tell me what effect that has had on your work in the community of being socially isolated and no longer able to deal with communicate the way you're accustomed to communicating. And then also maybe related to that is the benefits and the hurdles of that you have to overcome in communities that like we're talking about with social media and technology. COVID-19 and technology. How has that impacted your work in the community, Laura?
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about when you look at just the recent winter storm and disaster, who you really saw mobilizing a lot of the efforts were community engagement firms. And I can think of one in particular, nonprofits who are out there using their networks to make sure that the community was being served. And so in this time that things have happened, particularly last year, we had to refocus how we would do engagement. We were doing PPE drives. We were ensuring that we were part of food drives. If there was information we had to get out to the community, doing so. We still had our annual Christmas giveaway where we had multiple partners, and we saw about 900 cars and talking to the families and how it was so important for their families in that area to celebrate the holiday, but still going to them where they're at. We have found with a door-to-door, specifically in Colony Park and Lakeside, really interesting things have happened. One time a neighbor told me, how would you feel if you constantly had people coming to your door? What are other ways you're doing this? So we're starting to do direct mailers. We're also looking at working with folks who have access. We at one time were collecting phone numbers. We have a lot of families that tell us in Spanish, nomás mándame un text. Send me a text about what's going on so I can know what's happening. We're really having to think about the non-traditional, or going back to the ways in which you could get in touch with folks. Recently, we did a community engagement effort for the new pool that's coming to Colony Park. And we, as Shoshana mentioned, parent support specialists have been at the heart of all the work we do in Colony Park. We specifically work with the LBJ vertical team, and those parent support specialists recently helped us get a presentation to students. Some of these students, which we have witnessed firsthand, don't have access to Wi-Fi. And so particularly when students went back to virtual last year, our team worked on an effort with Capital Metro to make sure we got these mobile spots. But that's just a temporary solution, because as we've logged in the past couple of weeks, we see the children still having issues with their Wi-Fi, and so we're advocating to continue to bring up this issue about the digital divide and the fact that if you're doing everything online, you're not reaching everyone, and who you're reaching is probably not the constituent who you want to say you're really reaching, the community. And so we've had to really rethink about how we're doing engagement. Telling everybody that if you really want to get at the heart of who you want to reach, and if you want to reach the same people who've been giving you feedback, then yes, go online and do your meetings online. And we still do some of that. We absolutely still have to. I almost think for community engagement firms and people doing this work, we're working 10 times harder, because not only are having to keep up with the latest technologies and making sure our meetings run fabulous and videos and engaging people who are online, but we're also having to do what we've traditionally done, which is the grassroots outreach, but it's having to be more in front of people where they're at. So I would say, Jay, we're really having to work on all different types of ways. We don't have ways to convene anymore. For the safety of everyone, we can't have these public open meetings, so we're having to think differently. And I would say direct mailers and calling people and seeing them where they're at these food distributions has really given us some great feedback, has kept us connected as well. But I don't think we have a solution, this technical divide. For those of you that are coordinating public meetings, one of my colleagues had a fabulous idea, and I'll just share it. How do we get word out if we are going to have a development? How do we use flyers differently? We're starting to come up with, how do we get QR codes on our flyers and have all of our flyers digital? Because the reality is that now when you go somewhere, you have to use a QR code, but a family member may not know how to do that. So how do you still get traditional word out to everyone? So having to use various different mechanisms has definitely been the way that we're moving forward now at this time, and probably for the foreseeable future. Continuing to work with the schools has been at the heart of our work.
And just to piggyback on what you just mentioned with flyers, one of the things we realized very early on in the pandemic was when we would send people just a link to click on for a flyer, they didn't know how to click on a link. And like the amount of the digital divide, we work with folks every single day and we didn't realize it. So then we've started doing PNGs because not every phone is able to see a PDF. So some things are just as simple as that, of like kind of focus grouping what you're doing and being like, oh, if you're sending a flyer through text, like make sure it's a PNG. And that makes a difference in terms of who's going to be able to receive it and use it.
We're going to have to cut short our conversation here in just a few minutes, but let me ask you a couple more questions. What do you do when you have a diverse group of interests in the community, and their positions are really diametrically opposed, or don't really fit one another? And you might say that between homeowners and renters in some circumstances, but there could be different constituencies. I know, Sean, you described to me some situations in which you had a very diverse group of people, then they didn't always agree on the same topics. How do you reach consensus when you've got different constituencies within the community advocating for certain positions with respect to the development of the project? And ultimately, if you can't reach consensus, how do you resolve the dispute? How do you ultimately make a decision and move forward? And Sean, I'd ask you that first, and then I'd like to get Laura's take on that.
Yeah, consensus can be a dirty four-letter word sometimes, and it's a tough one to kind of get to. And as a developer, just throwing my developer hat on, ultimately you have to look at your bottom line and your financial numbers. You just have to, or you're going to end up bankrupt, and that still is the case for a nonprofit like ours too. And so I think what's important is to when you're talking about your project, you're talking about the city process, et cetera, to really think about the lowest common denominator in terms of understanding in the room. I see a lot of developers speak way over the heads of understanding of people. I think that's a real common mistake. And I also think that, casting a wide net is a really good idea. From a developer's perspective, I think a lot of developers are almost wary of getting an opinion about something when they might not need to necessarily, like they might not need a zoning change or whatever. But there is a richness in getting feedback from community members. There is. And just the fact that you asked is going to make that person believe that, you're listening to them a little bit. That's all that I would say about that. I know we only have a few more minutes.
Mark, can you add a comment to that?
Sure. I've learned to be, I actually have learned to be uncomfortable in the uncomfortable conversations. It's where the learning begins. Mm-hmm. And I say the best advice to developers is don't run away from it. Don't try to find a way to get away. You have to listen to what the conflict is, and you have to give it its time and air and space to breathe, because there's something at the heart of what that issue is, or what the conflict that the community member is bringing to you. And you may not be able to solve it, but you may know someone who works in a specific department, or you may not be the right person, and you can say, that is not relatable to what we're doing right now, but you know what, we hear you, we understand where you're coming from, and we want to be part of making a solution for that process. So I've actually embraced conflict. I have to say, I get to work with Miss Barbara Scott, who many of you know. She's an advocate in the community. She's going to tell you the way it is. There's many community leaders, Latino and Black community leaders in Austin, and they're going to tell you the way it is. And it's because they've had a lived historical experience that we have to acknowledge. And I think once you embrace that, you allow it to take space. It doesn't have to overwhelm your project, but there is some great learning. I hope there's some of my colleagues on this call right now that are probably smiling that have said they've been better for the conflict that's come forth. We can't run away from it. It is their lived historical experiences, my lived historical experience as a woman of color, is what it is. And so I think we have to embrace conflict. We have to find ways to work with it, work through it, work with the people who are experiencing it. And I just want to end with one thing. You know, once you've experienced inequity, you can't, and you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And it's the one reason why I started my firm and my organization, because if you truly are about making sure that people have equity, once you've experienced it and seen it, you can't unsee it. And so if you are doing community engagement and you truly believe in representing the community, you're going to have to deal with these tough conversations, and surround yourself by people that are interested in being in the fight. And I'm one of those people, probably many of the people on this panel and have been here. If you're really here to make change, Austin is changing. If you're really here to have some, you know, intentional community engagement, you have to be willing to have the good and the bad.
Right.
So
let me kind of wrap us up, and I'll ask for your brief comment after I make a short comment here. During this conversation, we focused really on the Eastern Crescent, this section, you know, of East Austin that has a crescent shape on the eastern part of our community. And we focused particularly on marginalized communities, particularly communities of color that have had historical discrepancies in social determinants of all kinds. But can't we assume, though, that the principles that we've been talking about for community engagement could be applied anywhere? As you said, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So for the developer who can't wait 10 years to learn all of this, isn't there something that we can do to capture the knowledge that's been learned, you know, through this process, and to make that available to others who, every neighborhood is a little different, but a lot of general principles have been learned as we have focused more on the equity issue. We know a lot more now than we knew 10 years ago about this process. And it's not just an Austin issue, I believe. I think that if you look at outside Austin, whether it's Round Rock, Pflugerville, Georgetown, San Marcos, all of these communities have historical roots that create the same kind of discrepancies that we experience in Austin. And sooner or later, they're going to be facing many of the same problems that we have. And these lessons can be learned, you know, throughout our region, not just one place. That's my opinion. Do you think that's overly optimistic that it could be shared that way among other communities, or is it just simply something that we deal with by neighborhood?
I think it's totally applicable, but yet at the same time, I mean, Austin, I mean, we are the fastest gentrifying community in the United States, especially 78702. I mean, the fastest. Maybe Brooklyn might be ahead of us, or Treme down in New Orleans, but so I mean, change is everywhere in Austin. Change is extremely difficult, and I wanted to say too that, you know, developers need to understand that things are going to be emotional, especially if it's a controversial case. And you need to absolutely, just like Laura said, embrace that and understand that there's been so much change in East Austin in particular, that you should expect that kind of reaction.
Hey, Jay, this is Kazique. We're running over just a little bit. If you could,
sure.
If you want to wrap it up, and then we'll transition to our next section.
We just wrapped it up, Kazique.
All right, cool.
Thank you all for your participation in this, and we'll continue the conversation later.
Excellent. And you know, the great thing about this this panel and this experience we're having today is that this is not to be the opportunity to wrap everything up in one day seminar or webinar. The point of this conversation is to continue the conversations outside of this experience, and hopefully use this experience as a way of really kind of jump-starting these conversations and moving in a different direction that maybe you weren't able to do in the past. So with that said, I do want to make this transition. And what I want to do is introduce Mandy Lee from the NAACP. She's going to be talking with us about some important pieces here with our work today. Mandy, it's really good to see you again. Would like to introduce yourself and start your presentation?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Prince. Hi, everybody. My name is Mandy. I am calling in from the NAACP National, and it's such a pleasure to be joining a local conversation like this. And I'm even more excited to introduce our next speaker. But before I do that, I just want to share a few quick things that we've been working on at the national level and some lessons for this conversation about community involvement. So for those of you who don't know, just a very quick history, the NAACP was founded in 1909. We're one of the oldest and largest civil rights organizations in the country. We were founded in response to the ongoing violence against Black people around the country. And today we have more than 2,000 units and branches across the nation. Our mission is to secure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights in order to eliminate race-based discrimination and ensure the health and well-being of all persons. And I want to share with you a little bit about the work that I do. So at the national level, within our environmental and climate justice program, we started an initiative called Centering Equity in the Sustainable Building Sector. And the reason for this was to bring together NAACP members alongside building and sustainability professionals, like I'm sure many of you on the phone would identify to be, and to essentially figure out a way to make sure that the benefits of sustainable building are reaching communities on the front lines of the climate crisis and on the front lines of economic and racial inequality. So this image that you're about to see is a picture of who we are. We're committed to directly advancing the leadership of frontline communities to eliminate environmental and climate injustices. We're a network now of more than 500 people who are working together on a number of different projects. One of our kind of key central learnings and ways of thinking about this work is that sustainability without equity is sustaining inequity. We define sustainability to not just talk about environmental stewardship, but also to talk about racial and economic justice. Specifically, I want to talk to you about a project that's coming soon. We've been working together over almost a year now to develop a set of guidelines for community involvement. I've X'd out engagement and put in the word involvement in building and development projects and policy for a very specific reason. What we've been talking about is that there's actually a status quo when it comes to development that is truly a marginalizing status quo. And talking about engagement in our mind is really not where we want to suggest the direction of development and the kind of participation that frontline communities should have in the design of their neighborhoods. This is actually a tool that we have found incredibly useful. It was developed by a group called Facilitating Power and the Movement Strategy Center. It's a spectrum from community engagement to ownership. And one of the things that we've been talking about as we think about guidelines is that really what we see as being the minimum of what we expect from the development industry, from government, from community leaders, and from ourselves as community organizers is this level number 3. You can actually click once more, community involvement, which is giving voice rather than some of the other levels that are much more common of tokenizing, placating, or merely informing or ignoring community members as projects are unfolding. And I'm so grateful to have heard the stories of some of the past presenters, which really do embody these other levels of participation, leading up to the ideal, which is actually development showing up for Black and Brown communities and their aspirations and visions. And I want to share just a couple of lessons from the guidelines. I've talked about, marginalization kind of being the status quo, and that unfortunately, when our members talk about their experiences with development, they found it reasonable to assume that the ultimate factor for decision-making in projects has too often been profit or getting things done as fast and cheaply as possible. Having learned that, some of the lessons that they've taken away is that setting a priority for economic, racial, and environmental justice needs to be intentional. It needs to be at the beginning of a project as early as possible with the owner or developer. Or ideally, there might also be well-enforced regulations in place to hold projects accountable to these priorities. We've learned that we really need history and context to be able to make good plans. And an understanding that every issue is interconnected, to go back to the point about meeting community members' needs and making development actually a more holistic process. We talked a lot about, how do community members and residents call for community involvement? And some of the things that we've learned from our members is that it's key to meet people where they are, both literally and figuratively, to unleash the power of youth, to compensate community members as experts for their time and wisdom, to build partnerships and coalitions grounded in shared values and principles. And as we've already heard, that even during a pandemic and other times of crisis, when we can't physically connect, there are many ways to get creative and make the most of virtual connections as well as safe physical connections. And lastly, we've talked a lot about how community involvement is about long-term relationship building, that once better communication and participation systems are in place, each project and each policy is more likely to actually meet community needs and aspirations and better serve people. And because of this, I'll just end with the idea that, community involvement requires a willingness and a tolerance to increase complexity and decrease the control of those who are typically in power over the development process. And so this is our call to action, but I'm now delighted to introduce Nelson Linder, president of the Austin branch of the NAACP. President Linder, would you please share a little about yourself and the Austin branch and some of the lessons from your work about building meaningful local partnerships and supporting the vision of the NAACP? One of the other lessons from our guidelines is that guidance about involvement should actually come from the communities most impacted by projects and policy. So what should people on the call today know about collaborating with the NAACP on local projects and policy?
Well, first, I arrived in Austin in 1980 from United States Army. I was born in Macon, Georgia, Central Georgia in 1958. So I've been here a long time. And I've kind of had a chance to watch the city evolve, all communities, and that kind of pushed me into politics. So in 2000, I became the president of the Austin NAACP, but I'm also an insurance rep by training and by occupation. This conversation has been very interesting. And by the way, thank you for the work you've done in centering equity in sustainable buildings. It's been a long path. I'm in 78702, by the way, since 2000. This is one of the most gentrified areas in the country. We've had a lot of challenges here. When I hear the conversation, I hear about the obstacles and where we are today. We don't talk enough about doing this the right way. And what I've noticed is oftentimes we do it the wrong way because we're not really addressing the inequities that compound our problems when we even address sustainable buildings. Here's what I mean. We know now that without political and community alignment, it's not going to be done the right way. So we've learned that if we're addressing community development, we've got to make sure our political people and our community people are on the same page. And oftentimes, political people are downtown and they don't really reach out and understand what we are as a community. So we waste a lot of times, oftentimes fussing and fighting, when in reality, we have to look at the inequity and kind of start there and build trust and respect. But what I've noticed is when you see that in the community, we see a lot more progress. So I'm very happy that the NAACP has laid out a whole nother format because, green buildings are a civil rights issue. And when we talk about sustainability, think about what we just saw happen in Texas with the blizzard here and the damage that caused on folks who were living in unprepared buildings, who didn't have heat, who didn't have water. I mean, that's the consequences of not having these buildings built properly with continual updates. And right now, a few blocks from my office, folks still don't have water. So we live in these communities, you see very, very much every day what they're addressing. We have to address that first and make sure we talk about development. We have to ensure the folks need the most get it because they've been ignored for all these years. So I think this initiative, I think it's absolutely fantastic. When I read about what's happening in Denver and I see what they're doing there with this project the right way, it just encouraged me that some of the folks out there can learn from that example. But back to Austin, it's a very difficult process because we're still dealing with inequities. We're still dealing with trust. We're still dealing with displacement. The community I'm in right now was about 80% Black when I came in 1995 and 96. That's a major problem. So we've changed the demographics of this whole community. So I think we have to be very sincere and very honest about the damage that's been done. And so these communities require a lot of attention right now on just the basic things like water. One of the earlier speakers said that when you go visit people in these apartment complexes, they talk about things they need. They're on that level. They're still trying to have just life in general, not sustainment, the basic things like clean water and functioning heating apparatus. So I think, we've done the right thing by defining this, but I think we have to understand some of the lessons going forward, that to make this effective in every aspect, we've got to make sure we understand the importance of aligning politics with our community and make sure people are listening. And with the developers, they're critical part of this process. Nothing should proceed without equity, equality, and also justice. So you have to make sure these civil rights are being respected. And that's the tough conversations that's lacking oftentimes in many of our cities. So going forward, what we've learned is we're going to have to address equity. We're going to have to make sure that this is a fair and just process, and to make sure, number one, that those folks who are suffering the most, as we saw in the Texas blizzard, are put at the front and center where the basic things are taken care of. And when you do that, you're also creating an environment where you can focus on centering equity, sustainable buildings, and wide-ranging buildings on civil rights issue.
Thank you so much, President Linder. And I think that's probably the end of our time. So I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Prince.
Thank you. Okay.
Well, President Linder, it's really good to see you and hear you. And one of the things I'm reminded of in your presentation, Mandy, along with the comments of President Linder, is the importance of this conversation is focused on equity, but we're also talking about justice. We're talking about the liberation of people so they can have the quality of life that this community has, so everyone can enjoy that quality of life. And so when you talk about justice, it just invigorates me because this is what we're really talking about in so many, many ways. So thank you, President Linder, for being here. Thank you, Mandy Lee, for providing that, I think, really great information. And the last thing I'll say that I'm reminded of is that we need to have all the people at the table to create the kind of change that we're looking for in this community. All too often, people have been excluded and not allowed to be an equal partner in this work. And so I'm reminded of how important it is to have that. And so again, I want to say thank you for folks for being here today. I want to thank our speakers for sharing their great insights and having a really wonderful and powerful discussion. I want to say thank you again to Austin Energy Green Building and ULI Austin for putting this program together.